Take us back 40 plus years and what was happening in the communities and what kinds of needs were being identified and strived for.
If you think about it, 40 years ago from now was the late 1960s, early 1970s. That was an area of an era of very vibrant civil rights movement. It was also the inception of the war on poverty and the efforts around the Office of Economic Opportunity to develop communities that were at risk. What was formulated then was these movements around health issues, around youth issues, around community empowerment issues. So it was a very vibrant time. There were many community activists. Some were militant. We have some that still reside today, like Richard Moore. I can recall going to community meetings then that were jam-packed at the old Armijo School, which is now charter school. And the place would be standing room only. And there was people that were enthused. Some of them were enraged because of the neglect and poverty that had happened in mostly communities of color. And this was nationwide, but the manifestation in Albuquerque was around the barrios, the older barrios. In this case, Armijo and San Jose and all these areas where First Choice still resides, has a prominent presence. These became alive with these folks that were felt that there was needs that needed to be addressed that had been left untended, that there was a lot of racial elements to it, and in fact, it was born to be true. And so out of that came some very deep thought. The communities were very engaged in conversations around what the needs were. Obviously, health was a big issue, and it's still a big issue because so many folks just didn't have access to very basic care. Folks had never seen a physician their whole life. They had never seen a dentist. They never had their blood pressure checked. They didn't know any of that. I could speak to that because I was one of those that I don't think I went to a doctor till I was probably 18 or 19 when I first started college. Before that, I had never been to a doctor. We were always treated by the curandera, right, and home remedies. But obviously, there was illnesses that were being unaddressed. I recall, that some of my relatives had very bad diabetes and had gone blind and had had their legs amputated, and they had never received just very basic care. So in that era, in that time, all of this movement was centered around people getting empowered and having access to services, very basic services.
What were you doing around that time and who were you with? I think your dad was involved, right?
My eldest brother,
Okay.
my eldest brother Santos, who was actually was chief of detectives, so he worked for the sheriff's office. But he realized also, and he and his wife lived in Los Padillas, realized that, especially on the areas of prevention, that police work alone wasn't going to do it, that emergency room care was not going to do it, that we needed much more. So there was a group of really dedicated individuals, Petra Saiz, and I can remember Priscilla Gonzalez, Jimmy and Bruce Nieto, and Joe Fernandez, folks like that. Joe Montoya, who was also a police officer, apparently a police officer, formed a core of what we call the CAP agency, the Community Action Program. And they're the ones that were the driving and motivating force for communities coming together. And it actually reached out. It was not just located in the South Valley. I can remember going to visiting all these older communities also, Martinez Town in South Broadway and San Jose, and Los Padillas and Pajarito. We called it the barrio tour. We would go and visit with some of the elders and the leaders of those communities and really talk to them about what the issues that they were facing. And they were pretty common. They were universal, Our kids need better education. We need health care. Nutrition is not great. Unemployment was even higher. You know, these communities were neglected, and they're much. The communities they're old communities from before. From the early 1600s to the 1700s, before Albuquerque was Albuquerque. The settlements that dotted the Rio Grande had started from the early Spanish um, forays into North America, you know, and they began to dot the areas. That's why all these communities are named after families, you know. Armijo as an example, Barelas, Martinez Town, Duranes, those are all named after families. Los Chaves, Los Lunas, they were built along that. And so there was this rich historical, rich history that had been neglected, you know, in the system as it stood then. Um, the symptoms, of course, were all these aggravations of crying health needs, you know, people dying young or getting not treated for very basic illnesses. So all of that comes this very strong movement to for redress, for organizations to be developed to address these issues, and for them to be community driven. And you see that now in programs like First Choice, like Youth Development, et cetera, that I think we're probably from that era the two organizations that came out really strong and have survived. You know, some of the programs started in those early days are gone, you know, but I think because of good leadership and stewardship, even during some very difficult times that organizations have faced, they have survived, you know, and thrived, as a matter of fact.
Which two are those?
First Choice and Youth Development, YDI. I think we have the two what I would call most significant programs that came out of that, and they both have grown. We know First Choice has grown. I'm talking to Bob DeFelice. You know, the encounters has just grown. And what a critical area in healthcare, and healthcare has become such a national issue and debate that you know, I think some of that early work that was done by what was then called the family health centers has actually gotten the conversation advanced because they're so. I mean, now you're talking about 40 years of history. That's a couple of generations. So there are a couple of generations ahead in trying to address some of these issues. And we're having Medicaid modernization, we're having health homes, all of these discussions. All of these discussions were held 40 years ago. I mean, in some form or fashion. That's not what we called it. We didn't really know what it would be called 40 years later, but this is what it is now. It's helped the evolution of the fields.
Were you a student, a young program developer? How did you come to start youth development and coinciding with the development of the Albuquerque Family Health Center?
I was actually a graduate student. I was in my very last semester when I basically got a call and said, we'd like for you to apply for a position we have here as director of it wasn't called Youth Development either, it was called Southwest Valley Youth Development Project. So I came in, again, the building still stands that I went for the interview. It used to be a chiropractor's office. It is now the administrative office for the charter school that's there, and had an interview there. And I remember getting very distinctly, the folks showed up at my door like 2 weeks later and told me I was hired. I mean, in person. They brought me a folder and they gave it to me. And I was so excited they actually offered me the job that I forgot to open the folder, you know. And so when they left, my mind was racing. I said, oh my God, I got a job. I'm going to be the director. And so after they left, and I calmed down a little bit, I opened the folder and there was nothing in it. So I went outside. I said, they must have dropped the papers, you know. I was looking around the yard to see where they dropped the papers. So I finally called Bruce Nieto at the time, who was the chair. I said, Bruce, you gave me a a folder, but there's nothing in it. He says, that's right. It's your job to put something in it. I said, oh, I didn't get it. I said, I think I'm in trouble. So I kind of started that way. I was 23. I was one class away from completing my master's degree. At the very same time, the some of the folks that were on the board of YDI, the founding board of YDI, were actually working with Family Health. Bruce Nieto and Priscilla Gonzalez, who's still there. So our work immediately interfaced. Right away we were working on community issues, and they asked me, well, we need board members. So, I ran for election. We had elections then. You had community elections in all the areas. So I ran for an election. I was elected the board of directors, and there we go. We're off and running. It was interesting, very interesting times. It was very challenging because there was a lot of needs, and we were trying to take a community approach to a very scientifically based service, medicine. And so you had doctors talking to guys that hadn't had barely completed the third grade, and they're trying to speak a common language and trying to get to address needs. It was very interesting. Sometimes there was clashes of cultures as well. In the early days, there was a lot of activism around militant activism, black berets, brown berets, etc., that would show up and force to meetings to make sure that people's voices were heard. It could be a very intimidating thing when you walk into a room and you have in each of the doors people wearing the berets. Of course, that was patterned after the Black Panthers, which America was kind of horrified by that whole thing. Oh my God, all these people of color getting armed. So you could imagine the tension that went on. And some of the meetings were very heated. And they went on forever. I mean, at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're still there, you started a meeting at 6. But it was giving people a voice. And it had to be done. It had to be done. You had to go through that birthing process. It was painful at times. I mean, as a young man, I would say, what the heck am I doing here, man? I should be out with my friends, partying. I'm here at a meeting for 6 hours, 8 hours. But I didn't really get it till I was, I began to see the need and talk to people and see how the programs were actually helping, how folks needing medical care were getting it when they weren't getting it before. And it's kind of those things that you look back and say, how did we survive without it, How did we make it? Well, we survived, not very well, but we survived. And programs like First Choice have really improved the quality of life and the health outcomes of hundreds of thousands of lives. What was it? Something like 250,000 encounters, 70,000 patients. That's huge.
So tell me about these meetings where the community was voicing their needs and meeting with the educated people, the doctors who could help bring the services to the community. In your role, you were an educated man from the Valley. What role did you feel like you were filling in that space there sometimes?
I felt I was a bridge between the community in general and then those representing the medical field, where you're trying to make them come like this in a very different way. It was not in a way where it's traditionally you went to some doctor up in the Heights and you now had a clinic. It was in your neighborhood. It was in your backyard. And always there was issues of communication. There was a language barrier too. Some of our folks only spoke Spanish, or some of them spoke very little English. And most of our doctors then didn't speak Spanish, so you had just a language barrier. And so part of my role was to help interpret not only English to Spanish, but very basic English to very advanced English concepts around medicine, medical terminology. People didn't understand that, and getting folks to come from a frame of mind on one side to another one and meshing in the middle where where the common need was going to be met and where the greatest service was going to be delivered. That's not an easy process. I mean, you're talking about um, pushing an evolutionary process pretty fast. It was actually driven by a revolution. It was the Civil Rights Revolution. Remember, this comes right at the heels of the civil rights movements in the South. It comes on the heels of the assassination of Martin Luther King and of John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of anger. I mean, that the mood of the moment was explosive. So when you're in these meetings, you know, it was very, very tense. The presence of the berets at that time was to ensure that, you know, that people weren't rolled over, because remember, in the South, you had incidences of the police showing up in force, using fire hoses and clubs and batons for people that were advocating for basic civil rights. That was the time that we were at, you know. In retrospect, you know, you don't know that you were sitting on a powder keg, but it sure felt you were sitting on something, you know. And for a young person at that time, a young person, you know, I was at, you know, what the hell am I doing here, you know? Where is this going? And it was kind of an uncertain time, but yet it was a very exciting time. We really felt communities become alive and empowered. You know, we didn't always like what we heard. We didn't always like the way it was said, but it was necessary to be heard and said that way, you know. I mean, we had some fairly brutal meetings during those times.
So you mentioned Bruce Nieto and Priscilla, among others.
Mm-hmm.
Where were they from that they came and approached you and they had begun a program? You called it the Southwest Valley
Youth Development Project, yeah.
Okay.
Well, they lived in in Armijo. I mean, there's different elements of Armijo. I mean, it's a large area, but Bruce was from the Riverside, La Vega area. Priscilla actually lived down the street from me. I didn't know. She lived on Nancy, and I lived on Patton. And I didn't realize that they were actually monitoring some of the students that were coming out of Rio Grande through family connections, because the families were all connected. And when they saw that I was advancing, that I was going someplace, and then they felt, well, we need you back here. I mean, I could have ended up on the East Coast working with foundations. I could have worked with NASA. Early on, I was recruited by NASA and some big foundations. But they told me, no, you're not leaving. you have a role to fill here, and it's an important role. You know, I'm glad they did. I'm glad they prevailed because I think it's been, for me, one of the most satisfying things in my life, other than my wife and my kids and my grandson. Nothing more rewarding than this work, you know. And I still live there. One of the commitments that they asked me to make was that I not leave the neighborhood. And for me, it wasn't hard. I said, no, I don't be away from my mom anyway. You know, still attached to mom. So it wasn't a big sacrifice. But later on, as we began to raise a family, I said, this is, you know, most normal people, if they have the income, get up and move out. And we never did. But I think what that forced upon us is an actual realization of the issues that happen on a day-to-day basis. Because when you don't get up and move as quickly as your paycheck allows, then you actually see the struggle that's going on around you. It's not just you getting out, it's everybody else around you. And you also see how, well, what you're able to provide is the community is a voice and someone else that has made it in a different way. Because if you're the only guy in the neighborhood with a really nice ride and clothes and all that is the drug dealer, and there's no counter to that, well, where do you think an impressionable mind is going to go? They're going to say, hey, I want that. I want the SUV with the 20-inch rims and all of that, you know. And they said, how did that guy get it? And he's the slinger in the neighborhood. Well, that's the model they have. And I think our board was very wise in saying, well, we need a counter to that. and that's kind of what they asked of me, and well, 40 years later, here I am. I'm still there.
So you've been developing youth development, and you also played a role formally with Albuquerque Family Health.
Yes.
What was that, and can you recall the time
Um,
frame?
I believe it was from 78 to 82. I think I probably put in about um, six to 10 years. 4 of them were as chair of the board. And when things began to change, I don't know if Bob was there when I was there. I don't know who the board chair was, but we went through a couple of changes that were really traumatic in terms of the directorships. And I think I came in right at the time when they had hired Luis Gonzalez, and I was the chair during that period. And there was a lot of issues around that, and we had a lot of ups and downs. But I managed to survive 4 years as a chair, and I finally said, I can't be the chair and do this other work here too. But it was the late 70s, early 80s.
You had mentioned earlier that there was no health care, primary health care, and I'm going way back in the early part of the interview. You said you had family members who had to have legs amputated, feet. That implies that they went somewhere, right? And it had already become so bad.
Right.
Where did they go, and what was the norm if you waited for a long time for a health care issue?
You went to what was then called the Bernalillo County Hospital, which is now UNM. That's where you went, and usually your ulcers on your legs and everything from diabetes had gone so bad they had become gangrenous and had to be amputated. That's where you went. That's how drastic it was. You didn't get to see a doctor, or you went blind. I can remember my one of my great uncles being in a wheelchair and blind, and we didn't know. We didn't know it was diabetes. We didn't know that there was a genetic predisposition to it, as an example. We didn't know that there was treatments that you could do, and we didn't know any of that. So we were kept in the dark, and we paid serious consequences as a result. When you're not healthy, how can you be successful in life? How can you be 100% focused on education and a job and a career and a family and how to get out of this situation? It's one of the very basic needs that you have to be met. I myself, when I was born there, I told you where the health commons is, I was delivered by a curandera. I have 11 brothers and sisters. We were all delivered that way, except my youngest brother, because he was a preemie, ended up at BCM, the Bernalillo County Hospital then. My mom ended up there so he could be delivered. He was one of the first preemies that survived. He weighed 2 pounds. I can remember they brought him home and we put him in a shoebox. That's what we had. It was an interesting time. But we didn't have prenatal care. We didn't have WIC. We didn't have none of that. So
I'm thinking of one more question, and then if anyone else wants to throw out some more questions. So YDI has just celebrated 40 years, and coming right on the heels is this First Choice, now the continuing legacy of that healthcare center that was started. What does 40 years represent, based on that history of where it started and then where, and not just YDI, but kind of the institutions and the services that have been brought to bear in the community? What does it represent, do you think, for the community?
It represents a very significant milestone, because I believe that most folks didn't want us to survive. They didn't want this kind of response, this kind of community-based response. I mean, there's been a movement at the congressional level to do away with things like Head Start and primary health care. I mean, what is that? I mean, when you're fighting a fight where very powerful interests are working against you, and you manage to survive 40 years, that's significant. Because you kind of turn it topsy-turvy, because it's when you have these interests that don't want you to be around. It's a battle. It's not just delivering a service. It's fighting that as well. And surviving 40 years tells you something. It tells you something about the folks that set it up, the folks that continue to work there, and the communities that support them. And now all of these efforts have, like First Choice, have widespread community support. I can't tell you how many times I'm in a conversation and we're talking about the big healthcare systems. This First Choice doesn't come up as one of the very top names in there. I mean, now you're talking we're talking about UNM Hospital, you're talking about Presbyterian, you're talking about Loveless, and you're talking about First Choice. I mean, we weren't even a fleeting thought in discussions early on about medical care as an example. We didn't have a voice. It's these systems and that was it. I mean, that's significant, where you're in the lexicon now, you know. You're recognized by everybody. That's a significant mind change, and it's not an easy thing to have that, you know, to accomplish that. It's difficult. Bob can tell you every day that he sits on top of the monster and try to hang on and get it to go in the right place, that it takes a certain level of effort, commitment, and dedication by the folks that are that work there, and that have and their precursors to them, that set it up, that had the dream, that had the vision, that stuck to it, and found the right people. I think a lot of it has to do with, call it divine intervention, call it luck, that you find people like that, the Bob DeFelices of the world, you know, that are able to dedicate their love, the Michelles, Melindases of the world that want to do it. I mean, you all could be somewhere else doing something else, but you're not. You're doing this. So at the end, it's God's work.
Do you think the community's better for it?
No
for
question.
The IDI and First Choice?
No question. I mean, my neighborhood I can point out to you, much better. We can walk there. You don't have to have a car. You can walk there, and you walk in and you have access to almost every care that you need, every need that you have. If not, you're going to get referred to the right people. You know, if you have a toothache, you can go there. If you're depressed, you can go there. If you have a pain that I don't know where it's coming from, you can go there, and you're going to get as good a treatment as you're going to get anywhere. That's a significant victory for our community.
In the late 60s, early 70s, was community well enough defined politically to be obvious that this was the Armijo community? Or was it just family connections and
no,
so obvious?
It was well defined. I mean, we've always known what Armijo was, and remember this. There was also precinct and ward politics. You know, there is a whole political undertone to all of it. You know, I mean, but that's how people got empowered. You know, through the political process. I can remember going up to the legislature with a delegation of folks from the South Valley, and going up to our representatives and saying, "This is what we need." I mean, in mass. I mean, when you have that kind of strength, and that you know, it translates to a block, a voting block, and it was families, a lot of families, you know, that were involved. But they were representing the larger interest of the community. So yeah, it was well defined. In the mix between the political aspects of it and the community needs aspect were an interesting merging that I had never really thought about. I mean, here was a kid. What did I know? But when they became this way, you know, and merged, and we saw some real powerful leadership in the Senate, state Senate, and the state House arise out of these movements as well. It not only lifted the general population, it actually empowered a whole voice. I can remember going to the legislature, and all the leadership was white, all of it, and the folks from down south, Aubrey Dunn, et cetera, and folks like that made the calls even for the Valley. But within a decade of that time, then we began to see a rise of leadership from our own communities that spoke with our voice and our needs.
Another question is kind of changing the subject. Steve Gutierrez,
Mm-hmm.
who works with YDI, was telling me that YDI, the person who started YDI, um, was really focused on the question of heroin addiction,
Right.
because a son of his had
Right.
died, and that it began in a building kind of kitty corner from, well, right behind Dead Man's Corner.
Right. Hmm.
Is that?
That's true. One of the precipitating elements of the youth piece that was being discussed, well, the issues that was brought up around that time, a young man, Lawrence Lopez, I happen to know him. He was a year behind me in high school. Young, good-looking young man at age 17, experiments with heroin and overdoses. Out of that whole grief, the father, Lawrence, Larry Lopez too, decided he wanted to do something around positive activities for young people. That stemmed out of that. It stemmed out of grief. It stemmed out of pain, and rather than just folding up and saying, "Here's another dead kid," they said, "Let's do something." So it came from a very powerful emotion of grief, and loss. And that still drives us to this day. We see still to this day the loss of young lives, and it hurts.
That's how the little towns are shrinking. Is, we're not replacing.
We're not replacing them. Mm-hmm.
We're the, producers of that little town, like in Mora, our hometown.
I had a discussion on the state workforce development board. They went through and were giving us the unemployment rates in each of the counties, right? And so they talked about Mora. Mora had the highest unemployment rate. So my question was, well, what are we doing to address the issues that Mora has with unemployment? And the chair of the board says, well, there's not that many people there. And I says, what? He said, if you're telling me that the unemployment rate is 30% and the population there is 7,000, I said, that's 2,100 people. What do you mean that's not a significant number? And it just kind of floored me. I was like, what? And Representative Miera happened to be sitting next to me on that. He says, and he got on it right away. He said, that's 2,100 people that we have to be carrying out. We can't just write them off. Yeah. So we still have to fight that battle where, Mora's too small. South Valley, South Broadway. Any of the areas that we work, let's write them off. We can't write them off. Even though you might want to, you can't, Not only because it's a moral, ethical issue, it's an economic issue for you.